Hey, good day, everyone. Thank you for joining me on the Grit Guest Expert Series. The question that I am going to ask today is, how do you make a profitable product that the market wants? But in this context, that the global market wants. So we're going to get some insight in terms of product innovation within the international context. So today I have here with me Eric Rose, who is a product innovation and management consultant. So welcome, Eric, to the Grit Guest Expert Series.
Thank you for having me, Sarita.
All right, and one other thing, let me just make sure that with the type of work that you work with small companies and startup companies and established companies, correct?
That's right, both.
Fabulous. Okay, well, let's go ahead, dive in, get started. So before we start getting into the information for businesses about product innovation and how to succeed and be competitive in the global market space, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in this space.
Sure. Well, I've been involved in new product innovation for 40 years now. With my background in engineering, my MBA from Pepperdine, I really found the intersection of those two to be a passion of mine. How to bring successful new products from opportunity to market reality, moving through market research, product development, manufacturing, sourcing, and ultimately intellectual property commercialization.
Fabulous. And so, as Grit, as a customized market research institute, we're going to talk about market research. But before we get into that, I would like for you to just tell us a few things. What are the 3 keys to successfully develop a product that the market wants?
Sure. What I've learned over the years is that the product innovation process is messy. Often, it's many steps forward, some to the back, to the left, to the right, and eventually, hopefully, you actually get into market with a successful product. So I've built a system to put a framework around the product innovation process that people tend to understand. And that system is called 3 keys to successful new products. And the way the 3 keys work is marketability, understanding the go-to-market strategy, the business opportunity, the finance, the fundamental global needs for what it is that you're trying to deliver, the competitive landscape. All of that gets addressed first under marketability. Second is technical feasibility. Can you design, develop, and manufacture a product at a cost low enough where everybody in the channels of distribution make the margins they expect? I was at Mattel Toys for 5 years, and I learned very well the concept of target costing. So designing and developing a product at a target cost. Then the 3rd key in the new product innovation process that I've developed is protectability. So if you've really got a market, you really can execute against it, you better protect the venture so you don't get knocked off. Generally, that's creating a blanket of intellectual property, but it may be other things like first mover advantage in the market, or very strong branding, or perhaps supplier exclusivity agreements for key components to lock out your competitors in that target market. So that's the 3 keys to successful new products. It's marketability, technical feasibility, and protectability in that order.
Okay, great. So let's start with the first one, the marketability. So a company comes to you and say, hey, I'm looking to market my product, whether it's from another country coming to the US or from the US to another region, a specific country within that region with different political, socioeconomic, cultural environments. So how does the marketability framework work? How does your research to help them to make sure that that product will be successful in that market? Tell us a little bit about that, how it applies globally.
Sure. And it's a holistic approach in that understanding the market affects the way you do the product development, and it affects the way you protect your intellectual property. So the foundation of those 2 downstream keys is marketability. It's understanding where you want to go, what that opportunity looks like. So the first thing I recommend is understand what kind of anguish exists in the market where a product doesn't exist today to solve that type of problem. So maybe the product is too expensive that's out there today. Maybe the product is antiquated and it's too heavy. We'll talk a little later about a full face respirator in the PPE industry, where that product that I helped the company bring to market was one of the lightest weight, lowest cost full face respirators ever brought out into the global market. So understanding what anguish exists, and the anguish needs to be looked at from a global perspective. So let's say the problem is essentially common in North America and Europe. So now we know there could be an opportunity in both of those markets, and we need to dig deeper into what are the customers using now? What are the price points? What are the channels of distribution? What are the margins in the channel? And very important from a regulatory perspective and a product development perspective is what government agencies, whether it's a medical device or PPE, typically those are regulated. Even in many industries, juvenile products and toys are regulated. So what regulatory bodies are controlling those markets, whether it's North America, European, Asian, etc. You want to understand those regulatory requirements. All of that gets boiled down into something that I call a market requirement document. Often in my industry, we call it an MRD. And it'll put all those requirements, where you want to go, maybe even a commentary on packaging, retail strategy. Is it going to be sold through big box stores only, or is it going to be sold off shelf in a retail that's customer facing? It's going to be online only. All of that could affect the product development, and certainly the packaging may have effects on regulatory issues, and all that gets boiled down first into the market requirement document.
Great. No, thank you so much. I mean, and I like the term that you use, the holistic approach, so that companies are fully aware, especially when you're going into different markets, and you use the United States and Europe. But even when you're dealing with countries, developing countries, to make sure that you understand even how those countries operate, the regulatory, the government agencies, things of that nature, to really understand how to
Even
position
simple things like power and power availability and voltage and all those kind of crazy things that you don't think of.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. Then let's go to, just tell us a little bit more, just if you could expand on the technical feasibility.
Sure. So now the research, and this is usually very intensive, looks at the markets, looks at the competitors, looks at the pricing, looks at the value proposition, turns that into the MRD, the market requirement document. From the MRD, now typically the research and development group, the engineering group, has to turn that into something called a product requirement document. And I call that geek speak because often I'm a geek. And now we're talking about things like, well, if it's lightweight, what does lightweight mean? How light? Well, it has to be lighter than this or lighter than that. If it has to be low cost, well, how low cost is low cost? Well, it has to be a target cost of this, not to exceed that. If it has to fit on 80% of the customer base faces, what are those faces? And the faces that you find perhaps in Japan are going to be different than the faces you find in South America or North America. And so now you have to put all of that content into a product requirement document so that you can develop the product for those markets. Ideally, the product that you design and develop and ultimately manufacture is either identical globally with maybe package copy and language changes, instruction sheet changes, of course, with language. But ideally, as we'll talk about the full face respirator, the product itself accommodates a global market. But sometimes during product development, there'll be unique attributes by market. And so then the product requirement document may say, we're going to create a base platform and modules by market. So maybe there's a North American module or South American, North American module, but there's an Asian module, whatever. Different ways of looking at it. All of those technical things get addressed inside the product requirement document, including regulatory, expected life of the product, durability, warranty, all that stuff.
Okay. And just kind of connecting the marketability and the technical feasibility, then I'll get into the whole protectability. But when I think about other countries, like, so when you say North America or South America, even when you select a country, and I'm going to ask, is this something that you have encountered and how have you addressed it? Even within a country, you have different regions where, let's say, for example, Mexico. The northern part of Mexico is different from the southern part of Mexico or even the central part of Mexico. So does that kind of fit into some of the research that you do to determine whether a product, and we're still speaking generally, we'll come to the PPEs in a minute,
Sure.
but in terms of products and how they would perform in different regions within the same country market?
Sure. Early in my career, I was working in the durable medical equipment industry, and this manufacturer in Los Angeles made canes, crutches, walkers, bathroom transfer benches, shower chairs, and so forth. And back then, I didn't know enough to challenge the marketing department to say, are you sure you've done enough research? So I believed what they had said, and we come to find out that what we know in terms of what a bathtub looks like in the West is not the same as New England. Bathtubs in New England are narrower, bigger corners in the bottom, and sure enough, after spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on manufacturing tooling and molds, that shower chair was about an inch too wide to fit in about 20% of the market back east that had narrow bathtubs. And if we would have done enough market research up front, we would have found that out.
Right. Oh, and that's such a great example because I've lived both the New England area, originally from here, California, lived up and down the East Coast, and you're absolutely right. And that's a great example, which precedes the question that I was going to say, what's the worst that can happen? And you've just answered that question.
Limit your market.
Your product might not necessarily be the right fit, and then hundreds of thousands of dollars. You lose so much money. So for the listeners, take that into account, especially those that say, oh, I don't need all this research. I can do it myself. This is a perfect example, and that's just right here in the United States.
That's right.
So then let's move on to your third key, the protectability. So in terms of, and especially with intellectual property, that is a huge issue within, at least with many of the companies that I collaborate with, in understanding how to enter certain markets. And the question becomes, well, what's going to happen to my intellectual property? So if you could just kind of expand on that a little bit more within the global context.
Sure. So the first question is, where do you have market potential to sell the product? And are you clear about those markets? What's your unique value proposition, your competitive advantage through the research, both in terms of end users, distributors, just a wide variety of go-to-market issues, retailers. Now, if you really believe there's a strong opportunity, then it makes sense to make an investment in intellectual property protection for those markets if that product that you're developing is truly unique and novel and patentable. So not all products are patentable, and in fact, when I was at Mattel, probably 90+% of the toys were not patented because they would only stay in the market for 1 year. It was kind of a one-year wonder. I happened to have my name on a patent from Mattel. It was a disc launching mechanism, but it was going to be a global product that had many, many years of life as a disc launcher, whether it was Tommy Pickles and Rugrats, which is the way it came out, or it could be a Disney toy years later. But because we knew that globally, that fundamental intellectual property was valued for many years to come, the company made a decision to make the investment in the global intellectual property protection. On the other hand, if you think that you can maybe sell it in China where intellectual property protection isn't considered really much by anybody, let alone in the courts, you may not want to file intellectual property protection in China if it doesn't have any teeth. Or if you're going to be in a market that is going to be really small, maybe you're only going to generate, let's say, $100,000 a year with $50,000 a year in profitability, but to enter that market and protect that market intellectual property-wise, protection-wise, it may cost you $20,000 or $30,000. If you run a return on investment analysis, you're only going to be in market, let's say, 3 years. Does it really make sense? So intellectual property protection is always a business decision, and you have to make the business decision that you've got something to protect in a market that is economically viable to protect, and that you're prepared to make that investment to do so.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And so now let's use the example with the PPEs, the personal protective equipment. And so I know with you, you were the Director of Research and Development for the Moldex metric respirator. So first of all, let's see, what does a Moldex metric respirator look like? Fabulous. Oh, wow. And so go ahead.
This is a full face respirator. Many people know industrial respirators, of course, nowadays with COVID, as a disposable face mask, or maybe what's called a half mask that you might find in a car painting shop or furniture painting shop, factory, something like that. This full face respirator also replaces goggles or glasses and protects the entire face from any type of caustic chemicals. And then on the side, there is this little element called a cartridge retainer. And this is a platform for a global solution that could be a carbon filter cartridge or a particulate cartridge. And those cartridges may be different in Europe, well, they are, than you would find in the United States market, because there's different regulatory requirements, breathability, filtration, durability, all that kind of stuff that you put in geek speak into the product requirement document. This particular element, and there's two of them, one on either side, they now are essentially a platform that you screw on a cartridge. So this item has a number of patented features in it. It is one of the lightest weight, lowest cost, full face respirators brought out into the industry. And in 2011, when it was launched, it was deemed to be the best new respiratory product of the year at the Dusseldorf Worldwide Trade Show for PPE, and it beat out Honeywell and 3M. And Moldex won the prize to be the best new respiratory product of the year with this product. And it's still in market today, 10 years later. It's very successful.
Oh, and selling globally.
Selling globally.
Fabulous.
So this product, after understanding the worldwide requirements, comes in 3 sizes. This cartridge retainer is a platform which allows for worldwide acceptance on whatever cartridge, whatever market needs. And so this one product comes out of the factory exactly the same worldwide. The only difference is the packaging labeling, which language and so forth, and the user instruction sheet, which language and so forth. But fundamentally, the product that gets made in the factory, it's the same product. And then each market has unique cartridges that can attach.
Nice. And may I ask, actually, what are the top markets, the top international markets for
Well, Europe for sure.
Europe, okay.
Yeah.
And then following Europe?
I know Asia, both Australia and Japan were being looked at. I don't recall when I left in the end of 2011 to start my own company, product innovation consulting company. I don't know since then, it's privately held company, how those markets have emerged. But probably if you looked at where it's selling, you might find out. But honestly, I don't know at the moment how all those markets have emerged over the last 10 years. So often for many entrepreneurs and small manufacturers in the United States, they don't have a foothold in the market they want to go into. So that will require separate research, and that research can be done either, I have a research assistant, we look at the world globally in terms of opportunity, and then I have strategic partners, particularly over in the UK and other places where we could look at where the market is. In the case of the PPE, Moldex Metric had an office, they have an office in Germany, where they also do product development, market research, and manufacturing. And that gave them a very strong presence into understanding the market in the European market. And they had already been in disposable face masks and the half masks. So to be able to move into the full face respirators in the European market was relatively easy for them to research. Same dealer network, customer base, if you will.
Okay. And I like that you mentioned the opportunities, and I'm just going to add one little extra thing on the research side too for other markets, and I'm just curious if you've ever come across this. Also looking at some of the trade agreements, the types of agreements that we have with different countries that present opportunities for especially the smaller U.S. manufacturers looking to expand globally. So yeah.
Yeah, one thing I do recall is the question about Brazil, because I understand, you probably know this better than me, Brazil can be very proprietary, very insular. And the question becomes, as a small manufacturer, do you want to set up a legal entity, maybe even manufacturing, in that particular market in order to deal with the regulatory, the tariffs, the taxation? And that's really where your strength is, I'm sure. But once you know that, then being able to produce a product with design and manufacturing methodologies that's in accordance with what's normal in that market is important in R&D. And I'll just tell you one quick story. One of the Winnie the Pooh products I worked on at Mattel, we were originally going to make it in China. And then it turned out that there was some issues with getting it made in China, and we had some capacity in one of our Mexican factories. So when the product came back from China before it was really fully launched and was going to be made in Mexico, China was willing to solvent bond using chemicals the assembly, but the Mexican factory, no. We had to redesign the product to be screwed together with no solvent in the factory, which required a product development and redesign in order to be able to manufacture it in that market. So keeping those things in mind, where is it most advantageous to make it? And then what does that mean in terms of the manufacturing available there? And what does that mean in terms of the product design to manufacture it with those manufacturing methodologies? In the last year, I think it's accelerating. But generally, what I will tell you is, there's an example. I worked with one manufacturer in Los Angeles that was getting some molded parts made in China because originally they thought that was the lowest cost solution. But what they discovered is that the China factory had already automated manufacturing. Excuse me. And so my role was to bring that tooling back to the Los Angeles area because they were having quality problems with China. They were having lead time problems with China. They were having minimum order quantities issues with China. When those minimum order quantities were high, that meant that their warehouse space requirements were high. And warehouse space in Los Angeles isn't cheap. So now, by looking holistically at what is the total delivered cost of these items net when they actually arrive at the end of the assembly line to put them into the final assembly, it really ended up to be no different in cost from China to Los Angeles. In these particular cases, there wasn't a lot of labor, and these items were easily manufactured in Southern California. And now, instead of like a 10,000 minimum order quantity, your MOQ, the MOQ came down to 2,000 in one of the local factories I think they could even go down to 1,000. Now your warehouse space came down. Now your CFO, your chief financial officer, looked at cash not being tied up in inventory. So your cash on hand was better. Now your quality issues were much better maintained because you're controlling it right there in your own factory. And what happens when all of a sudden PPE demands, this was a PPE item, skyrocket and your orders go up? Instead of a 12-week lead time, it's a 2-week lead time. So now your sales can ride up at the same time and not be dependent on being in China. So I'm seeing more and more and more of that. And if the item, I talk about a rule of thumb, if the item is going to be very dense and small with a lot of labor, it may make sense still to do it in China. But if the item is big and bulky and not a lot of labor, it may make sense because of shipping and low labor content to do it in the United States, or if maybe there's some sewing, it may make sense to do it in Mexico. So those decisions now are really being looked at even more and more carefully about how to reshore or potentially how to nearshore being in Mexico versus, even years ago where they say, no, we have to be in China, we have to be in China, we have to be in China. I don't hear that the same way anymore. I think the most important thing in my world in product innovation and in the manufacturing world is really to think innovatively about how can you keep manufacturing in the US. And the first job I ever had as an internship when I was in college was a role called a value analyst. So when I was looking at the value, that customer that you're trying to get a product to has a particular value they expect. The method by which you deliver that value could be a plastic product, a metal product, maybe no product, maybe it's just a service, maybe it's a rented product, maybe you don't even sell the product. So the idea is, how do you think innovatively in delivering product and or service to your customers in a way that isn't preconceived? It isn't like, oh, it's a manufactured product, so I have to make it in China. No, it's how do I deliver the value that end user wants, regardless of whether I know how to do it that way or not. I'll tell you one quick story. I worked with a company in Ventura County outside of Los Angeles. They were not in a particular market. They were a manufacturer of remote controls for digital projectors. Slide forward, slide back. And they wanted to get into bigger markets, didn't know how to do that. And I said, well, who are your customers? And they said, well, digital projector manufacturers. I said, no, your customers are sales executives, road warriors, keynote speakers. They want value. In the end, after doing market research, we identified there was a whole new product category of portable audio where they could have a little portable PA, it would fit in the overhead compartment of an airplane, come with a wireless mic, sell for under $1,000, fold up like a laptop. They were not in that market. I found them a strategic supplier based in Chicago to do the design, the development, and in their China factory in this case, deliver the finished goods on pallets to the Ventura County warehouse. They opened up a multi-million-dollar revenue stream on a $35,000 investment, even though they had never been in that market before. But their customers wanted value. It was a very different way than they had ever imagined they would do before to deliver that customer value. And that's my keep in mind takeaway for today.
Fabulous. Thank you. And just to add to that, to kind of put it in the global context, when you're trying to sell to your customers overseas, it's the exact same thing. The first part where you said about not having these preconceived ways or ideas of doing things, to make sure that it's delivered in a way that the way for a certain demographic, right? Your particular target markets within that country and understanding consumer behavior and doing research on those markets so that you can tap into specific markets, not just, oh, I want to go to Uruguay in South America. Uruguay always comes to mind, Uruguay, but to understand who are your clients for services or your customers, your consumers within that market. So thank you so much. And then just tell us a little bit about how people can find you.
Sure. You can find me on the web at my website is ericpaulrose.com. You can always find me, just Google ericpaulrose.com or Eric Paul Rose. I'm on LinkedIn as well. And again, my business is about helping entrepreneurs and small manufacturing companies move new products from opportunity to market reality, generating new revenue, often in adjacent market categories that they hadn't even thought of before, using maybe even existing assets.
Fabulous. And we're going to have your contact information in the comments section or the description here on the YouTube channel as well, so that people can reach out.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarita.
Thank you so much, Eric, for taking the time and to share such great insight. And thank you for joining me on the Grit Guest Expert Series. Bye-bye.